And hopefully, as you've seen us moving through project number 2, we're repeating some of the same deliverables. You're kind of polishing and honing in that craft. We're also layering in some, and hopefully you see how each deliverable, each step in the overall UI UX process builds upon each other to expedite the process, to make it faster, and to give you a clearer picture of what it looks like to create a final digital web product, a prototype, something that can be interacted with, to sell a business case, to hand off to a development partner, or to pitch an idea or a concept. As we submit our final wireframes tonight, I just wanted to provide some tips and tricks based off of what you submitted this past Thursday, and also go over it, kind of an assignment overview, and run through the requirements for your final wireframes. So let's jump in here and maybe just start with some tips when submitting your final wireframe. So one thing is it's important to consider polishing your wireframes and the presentation itself. Already thinking about polish and presentation. And so you can see she's got a nice logo here in the top left. Each of her 6 pages that she has in her PDF have the wireframe, the type of deliverable it is, with the name of the page itself that we're looking at. And of course, for this project, we're only worried about desktop, and so you have the desktop view. It's created nicely in this frame, and so obviously it falls well below this kind of screenshot snapshot here. I think this is just a really good example of considering polishing up your final wireframes. The great example of that here with Creeks Bend Apartments, and also considering the presentation itself. And why this is so important is because you can hand off these wireframes to a business partner, to a client that you're trying to sell for your services for a freelance project. And they can look at this as a part of a completed package for the work that you're doing for them. And so as you think about this course, you think about the deliverables that we're building, building upon each other to create a beautiful case study, or perhaps a portfolio piece when you go to build that for job interviews and things like that. It's important to think about each of these as a standalone polished deliverable. I think this is a great example of it. Nice logo in the top left, has a detail of what page we're on here in the top right. And again, that's on all 6 pages that are submitted, giving us the detail of what page we're on, and a nice logo to keep it all cohesive. And then also this is framed quite nicely within this larger page that we have kind of outside of this screenshot here. So tip number 1, thinking about polish and presentation. Tip number 2 is to make sure that these are hand-drawn and readable. One of the things y'all have experimented in is maybe some digital, like hand drawing this digitally. And that's okay. Whether you use Procreate or you're using an Illustrator, the important thing would be to make sure that you're also keeping in mind those requirements. The 6 individual pages, hand drawn, annotated in a readable format, and that's really key as you think about doing things that are hand-drawn and submitting those off to a client. They need to be able to read your handwriting, and so that might take a little extra time for you to actually think about that and focus on it. And I think this is just a good example here. I can't tell if this is hand-drawn physically, kind of on a hard copy, or if it's maybe in Procreate. I think maybe it might be digitally hand-drawn, but you can see it still feels sketchy. It's still rough. We're not worried too much about the actual UI or the visuals itself. And that's the important thing about wireframes. It's important to not confuse your client and be too polished to the extent that it looks like a final kind of grayscale version of the website. And so that's why it's important to stay hand-drawn with hand-drawn readable annotations. And I think whether you do that on an iPad through a Procreate or Illustrator, or you're doing that based off grid paper or in your sketchbook, it's important to make sure that you're focusing on hand-drawn, readable, rough wireframes for this submission, especially for this course. Once we think about advanced interaction design and things like that, we might move into some more digital programs and platforms. But for right now, we're focused on mastering the hand-drawn, annotated wireframes approach to UI UX design. So important tip number 2, polish and presentation, remembering your polish and presentation, and then also your making it hand-drawn and readable. And a good example here with the Hawthorne apartments. All right, tip number 3 is your photo angle. And so keep in mind as you submit these examples that your photo angle matters. And so if it's kind of skewed and it's off tilted a little bit, it makes it really difficult to read. So, when you think about UI, UX design, the U stands for user. And even in this, example, this deliverable that we have here for wireframes, it's important to keep in mind your end user, who would be your client or our business partner or development partner in this case. And so it's important to think about your photo angle. And here's a great example, the Modern Exchange. I believe this is Miracle. And again, you can see here, this is kind of a straight on photo. If you're scanning it, obviously you don't have to worry about that because you're going to be scanning it flat. But if you're taking a photo, make sure that you're close enough that we can read your annotations, that we get a good, crisp, quality photo, and that the angle is straight on and not the photo is straight on and not angled in any way. And that's super important as you think about keeping this polished and presentable, that it's readable, and that photo angle is really important as you include that in your final submission here. But you can see here we have 3 kind of featured areas, and on the left and right side we have kind of the outside gutter space of the container. And that's important because that allows you to control the width as a designer. If you get into kind of more visual UI designs and kind of advance in your career, you might explore kind of an edge-to-edge layout, and that's okay. We're not focused on that right now. It really makes it difficult if you're not familiar with how photos resize and scale when things go edge to edge. And so right now, when you have content on your page, just keep in mind keeping it inside of that container. It's going to be super helpful as we move into the prototyping phase of this. And also it gives you a little bit of control as a designer as to what width that's actually going to appear in kind of max in your if you were building this in a final UI. So polish and presentation, hand drawn and readable, photo angle, and then keeping in mind the content and the grid. Also too, if you stretch your content edge to edge, what's really nice about this number 14, 15 section is the text here is confined maybe to about 4 or 5 columns here. And you can imagine if we stretch this out, these lines of text might go really long, and that struggle will create a struggle for readability. I'm sure we've all seen sites or had to read forms or even documents where it just feels like the text goes on for so long on the screen. And then sometimes it's hard to go back and see where line 2 actually starts. And so keeping your content in a grid, constrained to those elements, forces you to make some decisions as a designer, but then also it just helps you control the width of your content, makes it a little bit more readable. So keep that in mind as you submit your final wireframes tonight. All right, our 5th and final tip for submitting your final wireframes to keep in mind as you submit those wireframes tonight is making sure that you include from your header to your footer. This is, I believe, and you can see here at the very top we have number 1, we're showing the navigation. And at the very bottom here, number 10, we have the footer, and we have some details as to the left. It's going to include hours and logo and address on the right, maybe some social media icons. It's important as you think about your design that you're thinking about it in its entirety, from its header to its footer. You don't want to leave any area or room to guess when you're presenting these, when you're submitting these, whether to myself or to a client or in a final presentation. You want to make sure that you give the viewer of this, the consumer of these wireframes, a good indication of everything that you're thinking about as a UI, UX designer, laying out this page. So make sure when you submit your final submissions tonight that you include everything from a header to a footer. So hopefully this was helpful, these tips and tricks as you go to submit your final tonight. Remember to keep it polished and remember your presentation, those 6 individual pages, and to keep those in a nice presentable format for your end user, hand-drawn and readable, making sure that you're practicing kind of hand drawing and mastering this craft before we maybe even start thinking about what it looks like to use a digital tool. Want to make sure we're saying hand-drawn and readable. Those annotations are readable. Remember your photo angle. Make sure that you don't have any awkward angles that makes it difficult to read or creates an awkward visual there in your final submission. remember the content in the grid, and it's okay for you to kind of break the edges with photography and with other illustrative elements, but just make sure that your content, and even here with Macy, we see kind of a left and right space here outside of the grid, outside of the content, and that would be important to think about as you submit your final night, and making sure that you have your header to your footers. Hopefully 5 helpful tips and tricks as we go into our finals tonight. All right, let's go over the instructions for this assignment. So make sure you're submitting a PDF of 6 minimum pages within that. You can choose 6 pages that are in your IA map. If you want to do more than that, that's great. At the end of this, we're going to have just a really nice prototype, clickable prototype, as we'll talk about in some future videos for this work. And so 6 is a good number. If you have more than that, that's great, but shoot for 6 as your minimum. The final file name guidelines, similar to what we've been doing before, project2_wireframes_final, and your initials there, .pdf. All right, and as far as the instruction goes, refine your wires based on your peer feedback. Update your wires into that presentable format that we showed here, showed in the examples tonight. Every one of them had the same type of quality layout that could be handed off and presented, and so great examples there as we looked at tonight. Your final wireframe document should include a minimum of those 6 hand-drawn annotated wireframes on 6 pages within your PDF. And share that final PDF along with 200 to 300 words within your groups, explaining why you might have made some of your decisions and how you're feeling about your final wireframes.